The station had been floating in the same spot for over 200 years, and it had seen everything. It had seen empires sign peace treaties and then start wars the very next cycle. It had seen delegates walk out of talks and delegates weep inside them. It had seen the Dravosa combine crush smaller nations into nothing while the rest of the galaxy watched and said nothing. It had seen all of this and more. But no one on the station, not the old guards, not the translators, not the senior staff who had worked there for decades, had ever seen anything quite like the morning the human delegation walked through the front gate. The gate itself was enormous. It was designed that way on purpose. The architects who built Valathra Station understood that the first thing a delegate saw should make them feel small. It was a political tool shaped like a doorway. The ceiling was 30 meters above the floor. The walls were carved from a pale blue mineral found only on the homeworld of the founding species. The light came from thin strips of gold-colored energy that ran from the floor all the way up to the top of the arch. Every species that came through that gate responded the same way. They slowed down, they looked up, they adjusted their posture. Some of them straightened their back, some of them pulled their ceremonial robes tighter around their shoulders. The Sorvati always lifted their chins when they entered, because among their people a lifted chin meant you were not afraid. The humans did not look up. The three of them walked in at a normal pace like they were entering a building they had been in 100 times before. The one in front was a man of medium height with dark hair going grey at the sides. His uniform was plain dark blue with a small emblem on the chest. The emblem was just a circle with a dot inside it, representing Earth. Though from a distance it looked like nothing at all. He had his hands loose at his sides, and he was looking straight ahead with an expression that was not a smile exactly, but was also not serious. It was something in between. The two people behind him were younger, a woman with short red hair who carried a flat data case under one arm, and a tall young man with wide shoulders and a calm face who looked like he was trying hard not to look too impressed by the ceiling. He almost managed it. The guard at the desk, a Valori, 7 feet tall, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across her face, looked at the 3 humans and then looked at the entry log and then looked at the humans again. Earth Confederacy, she said. That's us, the man in front said. Marcus Idris, lead diplomat, good to be here. He said it the way someone says good to be here when they actually mean it, which was strange because most delegates said it the way someone reads a line from a script. The Valori guard processed their documents and let them through, and then she watched them walk down the main corridor toward the delegate housing wing, and she felt something she could not name. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you hear a sound in a quiet room and you cannot tell where it came from. The Conclave Centennial Summit was considered the most important gathering in a generation. 41 species had sent representatives. 11 of them were considered major powers. 3 of them, the Sorvati Imperium, the Dravosa Combine, and the Karlak Federation, were considered the powers that everything else revolved around. The Sorvati had sent Princess Ureldera. She arrived 2 days before the summit opened. As was tradition for the Sorvati royal class, she came with a delegation of 22 and a personal security team of 8 and a cultural attaché who existed solely to make sure no one accidentally insulted her by using the wrong form of address. She was not what people expected the first time they saw her. Sorvati were tall and silver-skinned with 6 arms that moved independently, and eyes that were a deep and steady amber color. Her face was sharp, and her posture was the kind of posture that looked like it had never once slouched in its entire life. She wore deep red ceremonial dress with a high collar, and her 6 arms were arranged in the formal resting position, which among her people meant I am calm and I am watching everything. She had been doing diplomacy for 40 years. She had ended 2 wars. She had restructured 3 trade agreements that everyone else said were impossible to restructure. She had once talked a planetary governor out of a military strike by having a single private conversation with him that lasted 9 minutes. No one knew what she said in those 9 minutes, and she never told anyone. She was not a person who was easily impressed. When her cultural attaché told her the human delegation had arrived, she had looked up from her reading and said, "How many did they send?" 3, the attaché said. She looked back at her reading. 3. Yes, Your Grace. She said nothing else, and her face did not change, but she filed that detail away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were worth thinking about later. The welcome reception was held on the evening of the first day. It was a large room filled with soft light and low music from a 7-piece ensemble playing instruments that came from 5 different worlds. The food and drink stations were set up around the edges, and the center of the room was open so that delegates could move around and do the careful social work that always happened before the formal sessions began. Every species had its own version of this kind of event, but the purpose was always the same. You looked at who talked to, who you watched, who avoided, who you noticed, who entered a conversation, and who left it, and how fast you built a picture of the room. Marcus Idris was very good at this. He moved through the reception slowly and easily, and he talked to everyone. He did not stay with any one group too long. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke he asked questions more than he made statements. He had a way of standing that made him look open and unhurried, and the strange thing was that it did not appear to be a performance. It appeared to be simply how he was. The Karlek delegates liked him. Immediately the Karlek were a small round-bodied species with high voices who laughed easily, and Marcus laughed with them and they laughed more. The Morval delegates were more cautious. The Morval were ancient and proud, and they tested new arrivals by saying something technically polite that was actually a quiet insult to see how the arrival responded. Marcus responded by saying something technically polite back that was clearly not an insult at all, but somehow pointed out the test without accusing anyone of anything. The senior Morval delegate looked at him for a long moment and then gave a small nod. Which among the Morval was a significant thing. The Dravosa delegates did not talk to anyone. And no one talked to them. This was normal. Princess Ueldara stood near the far wall with 2 members of her delegation, and she watched the room the way she always did, quietly, completely, missing nothing. She watched Marcus Idris work the reception, and she noticed the thing that she had heard about but not yet seen with her own eyes. She noticed that every species who had prior history with humans, the ones who had traded with them or fought beside them or signed agreements with them, every single one of them treated the human man with a kind of careful respect that was different from the respect they gave to other new delegates. It was not the respect you gave to someone with a big fleet or a powerful economy. It was something else. It was the kind of respect that lived in the body rather than the mind, the kind that came from experience rather than reputation. She watched one veteran Sovati trade delegate who had worked with humans before physically step back to give Marcus more room in a conversation, and she watched the delegate's posture shift from formal to almost deferential, and she thought that was very interesting. At the end of the evening, Marcus Idris crossed the room toward the food station near where she was standing, and she got her first close look at him. He was unremarkable in the way that some very remarkable things are unremarkable. You could walk past him in a corridor and not look twice, but if you were paying attention, if you watched his eyes and the way they moved and the way he held his body and the way the people around him unconsciously angled themselves toward him, then something else became visible. Something patient. Something that had been waiting a very long time and was not in any hurry. He glanced over and saw her watching, and he did something that almost no delegate had ever done to the Princess Ueldara of the Sovati Imperium in a formal diplomatic setting. He smiled at her like she was just a person standing near a food station. "Good spread tonight," he said, and then he picked up a small dish of something and moved on. She stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to her delegation and said nothing. But in the private part of her mind where she kept the things worth thinking about, she added his face to the list and moved it immediately to the top. Princess Ueldara did not sleep that night. This was not unusual for her. She had gone without sleep many times in her career. There had been treaty negotiations that ran for 70 hours straight. There had been crisis nights when a border skirmish threatened to become something larger, and she sat in communication with 3 different heads of state at once and managed all of them without raising her voice. But this night was different. She was not kept awake by urgency. She was kept awake by curiosity. She sat at the desk in her quarters aboard the station, and she pulled up the Sovati intelligence archive on her private screen. The archive contained files on every species that maintained a presence at the conclave, and humanity was in there like everyone else. She had read the surface file on humans before coming to the summit because she read the surface file on every delegation before any summit. It was a habit that had served her well for decades. But she had not read the deep file. She read it now. The deep file on humanity was not organized the way most species files were organized. Most files followed a standard structure. First contact date, population numbers, fleet capacity, economic output, notable political figures, historical conflicts, current alliances. It was the kind of information you could scan in 20 minutes and walk into a negotiation knowing the shape of what you were dealing with. The human file had all of that, but under each category there were subfiles, and under those subfiles there were more, and the further down she went the stranger it became. The biology section noted that humans were, by galactic standards, physically fragile, small by the scale of most spacefaring species, no natural armor, no enhanced sensors beyond their own reasonable range, no regeneration to speak of. And then there was a note from a Sovati xenobiologist who compiled the file. It said, *correction, limited regeneration observed at cellular level. Wounds that would be permanently disabling to a Sovati heal in humans within weeks in many documented cases. Recommend reclassifying *. She read that twice. The psychology section was longer than the biology section. This was unusual. Normally biology took up more space. It was easier to measure muscle density than it was to measure how a species thought. The psychology section began with a note from the analyst who wrote it. The note said simply, *, this section took longer to write than any file I have prepared in 30 years of this work. I am not certain I have it right *. She sat back for a moment, then she kept reading. The file described humans as a species that formed emotional bonds with almost everything. They bonded with each other, obviously, but they also bonded with animals they kept as companions. They bonded with physical places. They bonded with ideas and causes, and sometimes with objects they had owned for a long time. They bonded with their enemies in documented cases. There were records of human soldiers becoming lifelong friends with the soldiers they had been trying to kill after conflicts ended. The file noted that this bonding behavior made humans unpredictable in negotiation because they could not always be moved by pure logic or pure self-interest. They were often moved instead by what they felt was right, which was a category that did not exist in most negotiation models. There was a subsection on grief. She read it carefully. It said that humans had a higher grief response than any spacefaring species currently catalogued. They felt the loss of bonded individuals at an intensity that, in some documented cases, produced measurable physical illness. It said that humans had entire cultural systems built around grief, rituals, art forms, music, architecture, as if they had understood from very early in their development that loss was going to be a central feature of their existence and had decided to build an entire civilization's worth of tools for surviving it. But the subsection ended with something that stayed with her. It said, despite high grief response, humans demonstrate a recovery pattern that current models cannot fully explain after loss events that would result in long-term behavioral shutdown in most comparable species. Humans exhibit a documented pattern of resuming full function within relatively short timeframes. In some cases, the loss appears to accelerate capability rather than diminish it. The mechanism for this is not clearly understood. She read that last line 3 more times. The historical conflict section was the longest part of the file. Humans had gone to war with each other more times than the file could fully catalogue. Before their spacefaring era, they had destroyed large portions of their own planet at least twice in ways that should have ended them. They had built weapons that could have ended all life on their world and then had chosen, repeatedly, not to use them, which the file's analyst noted was actually more remarkable than building the weapons in the first place. But what the file kept coming back to again and again was the rebuilding. After every catastrophic event, natural or self-inflicted, the projections made by outside observers for how long human recovery would take were always wrong. They were always too long. Humans always rebuilt faster than anyone predicted. They rebuilt cities, they rebuilt governments, they rebuilt trust between groups that had been trying to destroy each other. The analyst had flagged this pattern as statistically significant and had added a note. Recommend reassessment of standard recovery projections for human-related events. Current models consistently overestimate recovery time by a factor of between 2 and 4 *. She reached the end of the main file and was about to close the screen when she noticed a subfolder she had not seen before. It was marked with a glyph she recognized immediately. The glyph was used by the elder races, the ones who had been in space for thousands of years before most current civilizations had left their home systems. It was a glyph that meant * classified by consensus *, and it required senior diplomatic clearance to open. She had senior diplomatic clearance. She opened it. Inside was a single warning in plain text. There were no statistics, no charts, no analyst notes, just one line written in the elder race common language that every senior diplomat was required to learn. It said, do not negotiate against a human who has experienced significant personal loss. The calculus changes in ways that standard models do not account for *. She stared at that line for a long time. Then she went back to the main file and opened the subsection on Marcus Idris. The file on Marcus Idris was shorter than she expected given who he was. It noted his age, 53 standard years, which was middle age for a human. It noted his homeworld, which was listed as Colony Vesta 7, a small settlement in what was then a disputed border region. It noted his entry into the diplomatic service at age 26. It noted his record, which was, even by the restrained language of intelligence files, extraordinary. 17 successful negotiation outcomes, 11 of those in situations that other diplomatic teams had already failed, 3 that other teams had abandoned entirely as unresolvable. But what stopped her was the notation about the Kareth Accord. The Kareth Accord was known throughout the galaxy. It had ended a 60-year war between the Sudari and the Pelvan, 2 species whose conflict had destabilized an entire sector and produced refugee crises that affected dozens of surrounding civilizations. Most diplomats knew the outcome of the Kareth Accord, but very few knew how it was achieved. The file told her. Marcus Idris had spent 4 years living among both the Sudari and the Pelvan alternately. He had no diplomatic immunity during that time because both sides had refused to grant it. He had simply gone in as a private individual and lived among the people and worked and eaten with them and learned their languages beyond the translation basic that most diplomats used, and over 4 years he had built a network of personal relationships on both sides that no formal diplomatic structure had managed to create. When he finally sat down at the table to negotiate, he was not negotiating between two abstract nations, he was negotiating between people he knew by name, people who trusted him, people who would not walk away, because walking away would mean letting him down specifically. She sat very still after reading that. She had done diplomacy for 40 years, she had studied every method and every framework and every school of negotiation theory that existed, and she could not find a name for what he had done in those 4 years because it did not fit any of the frameworks. It was not a strategy exactly. It was something that required you to be a certain kind of person first. She closed the file and sat in the quiet of her room and looked at the wall for a while. Outside the station, the stars did not move, they never moved from here, they just hung in the dark the way they always had, unchanged, indifferent, very far away. She thought about the man who had smiled at her like she was just a person standing near a food station. She thought about the warning written in Eldoret script. She thought about 4 years living among enemies with no protection. Then she got up and told her attaché to prepare a full briefing on all pending summit agenda items because she wanted to be very ready for the sessions that were about to begin, and she wanted to be watching Marcus Idris closely when they did. The main negotiation floor of Valathra Station was designed to be intimidating. This was not a secret, the architects had said so in their original design notes, which was still in the station's public archive if anyone wanted to read them. The idea was that a space large enough and formal enough would remind everyone inside it that what happened here mattered, that the words spoken in this room would travel outward into the galaxy and reshape things. The floor was circular and made of dark stone. The delegate tables were arranged in a wide ring with each delegation space marked by their species emblem embedded in the floor. The ceiling above was a transparent dome, and through it you could see the stars, which never changed and never cared about anything being decided below them. The tiered galleries that ran around the upper walls could hold thousands of observers, and for the summit's main sessions they were nearly full journalists, analysts, diplomatic staff from smaller nations who were not part of the formal proceedings, historians, and a great many people who simply understood that history was being made and wanted to see it. The sessions began formally on the second day. The first 2 sessions were procedural. Agenda setting, confirmation of rules, introduction of the major discussion items. The delegates went through them the way experienced professionals go through necessary paperwork quickly and without complaint because everyone knew the real sessions were coming. On the third day, the Dravosa Combine introduced their item. The Dravosa delegate who stood to speak was named Ketharan, and he was, by the assessment of almost everyone in the room, one of the most dangerous individuals currently active in galactic diplomacy. He was large even by Dravosa standards. The Dravosi were an insectoid species with hard outer shells that came in shades of deep black and brown, and Ketharan's shell was almost completely black with a texture that looked like it had been through several wars and had not been damaged by any of them. He had held senior positions in the Dravosa Combine for 30 years, and in that time he had personally overseen the annexation of 4 civilizations. He had done it all legally within the framework of Conclave Charter, which was the thing that made him so difficult to oppose. He stood at the Dravosa table and he introduced the item in a flat, even voice that carried no emotion at all. The Dravosa Combine was formally requesting the ratification of annexation claims over 3 civilizations, the Helva Collective, the Sorai Minor System, and the Palladi, all of which occupied space adjacent to current Dravosa territory. All 3 were small, all 3 were economically fragile, all 3 had military capabilities that could not seriously contest the Dravosa fleet. The annexation, he explained, was legal under Charter Section 41, which permitted a major power to formalize territorial claims over ungoverned or inadequately governed systems after a formal notification period of 90 days. The notification period had been served. The 3 civilizations in question had their representatives at the summit. They were small delegations, 1 or 2 people each, and when Ketharan finished speaking, every person in the gallery above looked at them. The Helva delegate was a young woman with pale green skin and very large dark eyes. She was holding the edge of her table with both hands, and she was not moving. The room went quiet in the way that large rooms go quiet when everyone in them understands that something very wrong is happening, and no one is sure whether anyone is going to do anything about it. The senior Karlek delegate cleared his throat and made a procedural note about the need for further review of the charter section cited. The Morval delegate made a similar note. 3 other delegates made similar notes. They were all saying the same thing without saying it directly, which was, "This is terrible, but it is technically legal and none of us are going to be the one to stand in front of it." The gallery above was very still. Princess Ureldara sat at the Sorvada table with her 6 arms arranged in formal resting position, and her face completely calm, and she looked at Ketharan, and she looked at the Helva delegate, and she looked at her own hands, and she thought about what the correct move was, and she could not find one that did not cost her empire something significant. Then Marcus Idris stood up. He did not stand dramatically, he did not push back his chair with any particular force or clear his throat, he simply stood up the way a person stands up when they have decided it is time to stand. Point of procedural inquiry. He said. His voice was not loud, but it reached every corner of the room because the acoustics were designed for that purpose. Ketharan looked at him. The look was the kind of look a very large creature gives a smaller one when it is deciding whether the smaller one is serious. The Earth Confederacy is recognized, the session moderator said. Marcus nodded once and then he began to speak. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice during those 11 minutes, he did not gesture dramatically, he did not use the formal elevated language that most delegates used when they wanted to sound important. He spoke in simple clear words, and the effect of it was like watching someone take apart a machine piece by piece and lay all the parts out on a table so everyone could see exactly what it was made of. He started with Charter Section 41 and he read it aloud in its entirety because as it turned out most of the delegates had only read the summary version and the full text had several clauses that the summary did not mention. He then cited 7 prior cases in which Section 41 had been invoked and noted that in 5 of those 7 cases the invocation had been successfully challenged on grounds that the invoking party had not fulfilled all prerequisite conditions. He then asked Keth Aran to confirm which of the prerequisite conditions had been fulfilled in the current claim. Ketharan confirmed 3 of the required 5. Marcus thanked him and then explained that the remaining 2 conditions had not been publicly documented, and that under charter rules the claim was therefore in a provisional status that did not yet permit ratification. The gallery above shifted. Ketharan said the documentation existed and would be provided. Marcus said that was fine and that in the meantime he was formally tabling a counter-framework under Charter Section 17, which permitted any conclave member to propose an alternative governance structure for systems under annexation. Review. The counter-framework he was proposing was detailed in the document he was now submitting to the session record. He sat back down. The session moderator confirmed receipt of the document and called a recess. In the recess, the Dravosa legal team reviewed Marcus's counter-framework and came back looking like they had eaten something that disagreed with them. The framework was airtight. It did not block the annexation directly because that would have been rejected as overreach. Instead, it created a legal structure around the 3 civilizations that would require any annexing power to assume full economic responsibility for them, including their debts, their infrastructure costs, their population welfare guarantees, and a comprehensive development commitment spanning no less than 40 years. It used precedent from Dravosa's own prior annexations to establish the terms, which meant the Dravosi could not argue against it without arguing against their own prior legal positions. It would cost the Dravosi combined more to annex these 3 civilizations under this framework than the civilizations were worth to them. When the session resumed, Ketharan looked at Marcus for a long time. Marcus looked back with that expression that was not quite a smile. "Take your time," Marcus said quietly. The Dravosa delegate said nothing for a moment. Then he said his delegation required additional review of the counter-framework and would respond in the following session. Everyone in the room understood that this meant the annexation was effectively paused and very possibly dead. The gallery above erupted. Not loudly. This was not that kind of room. But the sound that came down from the tiers was the sound of hundreds of people exhaling at the same time and beginning to talk all at once. The Helva delegate let go of the edge of her table. She pressed both hands flat against the surface and she looked across the room at Marcus Idris, and she said nothing because there were no words and also because she was a professional and professionals do not cry in the main session hall even when they very much want to. Princess Ureldara sat perfectly still and watched all of this. She watched Ketharan, who was one of the most dangerous people in the galaxy, sit back down looking like he had been moved to a position he had not chosen. She watched the small delegations of the 3 civilizations who had come here expecting to lose everything. She watched the senior delegates from the major powers who had all calculated that the cost of intervention was too high. And she watched Marcus Idris, who had apparently made a different calculation. He was looking at the document record now, already moving forward, already looking at the next item. The Velsorath feeling came back to her stronger than before. She had felt it twice in her life before this. Once in the presence of a general who had defended an unwinnable position for 3 years and held it, and once in the presence of a very old scientist who had worked on the same problem for 40 years and finally solved it. It was not admiration exactly, it was more specific than that. It was the feeling of recognizing something that was exactly what it appeared to be all the way through. No performance, no calculation on the surface hiding something else underneath. Just a person who had decided what mattered and had then gone ahead and made it matter. She wrote a single line in her private session notes and underlined it twice. Then the next agenda item was called and the work of the summit continued. The station had a corridor on its lower east wing that most delegates never visited. It was not marked on the standard maps that new arrivals were given. It was not secret exactly. Anyone who asked the station's navigation system could find it, but it was far from the delegate housing and the session halls and the dining areas, and so most people simply never went there. It was used mostly by maintenance staff, and it was long and straight and lit by the same gold-colored strip lighting as the rest of the station, except down here the strips were older, and the light they gave was slightly warmer and slightly more yellow than the light in the formal areas. Princess Ureldara found it by accident on the third night when she could not sleep again and had decided that walking was better than sitting, and had followed corridor after corridor until she ended up somewhere unfamiliar. She almost turned back. Then she saw someone at the far end of the corridor standing and looking at a section of the wall. She walked toward him because she had spent 40 years in diplomacy, and she had learned that the moments when you almost turn back are often the moments most worth not turning back from. It was Marcus Idris. He was standing with his hands in his pockets looking at a section of the wall where a previous maintenance worker had, at some point in the station's long history, scratched a small design into the metal, a rough shape that might have been a bird or might have been a ship. It was hard to tell. He heard her coming. The corridor was quiet enough, and he turned and looked at her without any particular surprise. "Your Grace," he said, and gave a short respectful nod. "You know who I am," she said. "I prepared for this summit," he said. "I know who everyone is." She came and stood beside him and looked at the scratched design on the wall. "You could not sleep either." "I don't sleep much at summits," he said. "Too much to think about." "The session today," she said, "the framework you tabled, it was prepared before the summit began." He did not look away from the wall. "Yes. You knew they would make the annexation claim. The Dravosi have made 3 annexation claims in the last 8 years in systems adjacent to new territorial gains," he said. The pattern was clear enough. She was quiet for a moment. Most of the major delegates calculated that opposing them was too costly. "Most of the major delegates are not responsible for the Helva Collective," he said. It was a simple answer, and there was no judgment in it. It was just a fact. He said it the way someone states the time. She looked at him. "Walk with me," she said. They walked slowly down the long corridor, and she asked him questions, and he answered them, and she noticed that he answered directly without the careful diplomatic softening that most people used when speaking to her. She asked him about Earth, and he told her about it in a way that was honest about both what was good and what was not good. He told her about how crowded it had become and how loud, and how the sky in some cities had taken generations to clean after the industrial centuries, and how despite all of that people loved it in a way that was almost unreasonable. He said that humans seemed to love things most when those things were imperfect and had survived anyway. She asked him what had drawn him to diplomacy, and he was quiet for a few steps before he answered. He said he had tried to find another way first. Something faster, something more direct. He said that for years he had believed that the problems between civilizations were the kind that required force to solve, because force was fast, and force was clear, and force did not require the other side to agree with you. She asked what changed his mind. He said it was not one thing, it was many things over many years, and then he paused again, and she waited, and he said, "I came from a small colony called Vesta 7. It was in a border region, a disputed region. When I was 23, there was a conflict in that region. Not a war exactly, more like a collapse, and the colony was destroyed." He said it plainly. "I was off-world when it happened," he said. "Supply run, I was the only one who made it out. The corridor was very quiet. I spent a long time after that trying to find something to do with what I felt," he said. "I was not good at being still with it. I wanted to make it into something. I wanted it to have a use." "And you became a diplomat," she said. "Eventually." He said, "Not right away. Right away I made some bad decisions. I was angry for a long time. Anger is useful for some things, but it is very expensive and it does not spend well. Eventually you are paying for things you did not mean to buy." She thought about that. "The colony," she said. "What was its name?" He told her. She stopped walking. Her 6 arms, which had been in the relaxed informal position she had allowed herself in this empty corridor, became very still. She stood and she looked at the wall in front of her, and she said nothing for a moment that was long enough to feel significant. "Your Grace," he said. She turned and looked at him, and for the first time in the conversation something moved across her face that was not the careful diplomatic surface she wore in all formal settings. It was something older than that. It was something that lived underneath the titles and the training. "I know that name," she said. He looked at her. "Not from public records," she said, "from a sealed archive, a Sorvati imperial file classified at the highest level." She watched his face, and his face was steady. "The border region destabilization," She said, 31 years ago my government ran a covert operation to shift the political balance in that sector. It was a trade protection decision. At the time it was framed as a minor strategic adjustment. She heard herself saying the words, and they sounded like what they were, which was a soft language for something that was not soft. The operation did not directly cause the conflict, she said, but it created conditions. It removed a stabilizing presence. It opened a space that other forces filled badly. She stopped. You know this, she said. You know my government's role. He looked at her. Without anger, which was somehow harder to look at than anger would have been. I found the file 12 years ago. He said, it took a while to get to it, and it took a while longer to fully understand what it meant. And you came to this summit anyway, she said. You sat across from Sorvati delegates in pre-summit sessions. You negotiated with members of my empire's trade coalition. You never used it. No, he said. Why not? He thought for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was choosing how to say it accurately. Because using it would have made it about me, he said, about what I lost, about what your government did. Using it as a weapon would have been fast and it would have felt like something, but it would not have helped the Helva collective. It would not have helped anyone. It would have just been me spending my grief on something expensive again. She looked at him for a long time. And then Princess Ureldara of the Sorvati Imperium, who had not knelt before any living being in her adult life, who had stood unmoved through the deaths of allies and the collapse of negotiations and 30-year wars resolved at single tables, felt something happen in her body that she had never felt before in a diplomatic context. It was not a decision exactly. It was more like a recognition. A recognition that she was standing in front of something that was larger than rank and larger than empire and larger than the careful calculations of power that had defined her entire professional life. Her legs bent. She went down onto one knee on the cold metal floor of a maintenance corridor in a station that had seen 200 years of history and had apparently saved this moment for now. Her head bowed. It was the Sorvati gesture of Veltorith, the deepest acknowledgement their culture possessed, given only to ancestors and gods and those rare living beings who demonstrated a greatness of soul that no title could contain. She stayed down for 3 full seconds. When she rose, her face was the face of a person who has just put down something very heavy that they had been carrying for a very long time. Marcus Idris looked at her, and his expression was not triumph. It was not satisfaction in the way that winning feels satisfying. It was something quieter and more tired and more real than that. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. That is exactly why I did. They stood together in the yellow light of the old corridor, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the station turned slowly in the dark around them, carrying all of its history and all of its treaties and all of its moments of failure and grace, and outside the walls the stars stayed where they had always been, distant and patient and completely indifferent to the small and enormous things that kept happening in the spaces between them. By morning, the station knew. Not officially, not through any announcement or report or formal communication, but stations like Valathra ran on people, and people talked, and the maintenance staff who worked the lower east wing had seen something, and they had told someone, and that someone had told someone else, and by the time the 4th day sessions were scheduled to begin, the information had moved through every delegation on the station in the way that extraordinary things move. Faster than they should, quieter than you would expect, and impossible to stop once started. The story as it traveled was simple. Princess Ureldara Sorvati had knelt in a corridor alone with the human diplomat, with no audience, with nothing to gain from the gesture politically, with no one watching. She had gone down on one knee and bowed her head. Among the Sorvati, this was called Veltorith. It had not been given to a living being outside of religious ceremony in 307 years. The last time it happened, the recipient had been a Sorvati military commander who had held a position for 11 years against a force 12 times the size and had saved 200 million lives in the process. The delegations who heard the story responded in different ways. The Karlek burst into immediate excited conversation. The Karlek loved this kind of thing, the drama of it, the meaning of it. They had a cultural tradition of storytelling, and they understood instinctively that this was a story that would be told for a very long time. The Morval went very quiet. The Morval were old, and they knew what Veltorith meant, and they sat with their hands folded and said nothing for most of the morning, but there was a quality to their silence that was different from their usual silence. It was a silence that was thinking very hard. The Dravosi heard the story, and their legal team immediately requested a recess from the day's sessions. Several smaller delegations sent quiet, unofficial messages to the Earth Confederacies. Communication channel. Not formal diplomatic communications, just notes, brief, and without ceremony. That said things like asterisk, we are glad you are here asterisk, and asterisk, thank you for yesterday asterisk. The young woman from the Helva Collective sent one that said only asterisk, my people will remember this asterisk. The Sorvati diplomatic corps went, as predicted, into crisis. The cultural attaché came to the princess's quarters before the morning sessions and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say but is not confident in the rehearsal. The senior staff have concerns, the attaché said carefully. I know what their concerns are, the princess said. She was at her desk. Reviewing the day's agenda, she did not look up. The political implications of Veltorith given to a non-Savati, given to a human, given without imperial sanction. The political implications, she said, and now she did look up, are that our empire has been carrying a buried file for 31 years, and the man who should be most affected by what is in that file came to the summit and worked in good faith and protected 3 civilizations from annexation yesterday and asked for nothing in return. The attaché was quiet. The political implications, she continued, are that I am the ranking representative of the Sorvati Imperium, and I decided that what I witnessed warranted Veltorith, and if the senior staff would like to have a conversation about what Veltorith is for, and when it is appropriate, then I would be happy to have that conversation at a later time. She looked back at her agenda. After the sessions, she said. The attaché left. The morning session was supposed to cover trade routing adjustments in the outer sectors. It became something else. Ketharan of the Dravosa Combine stood at the opening of the session and in his flat and emotionless voice announced that the Dravosa Combine was formally withdrawing the annexation claim against the Helva Collective, the Sorai Minor System, and the Paladi pending a full internal review of the counter-framework. Submitted by the Earth Confederacy. He sat down. The session moderator paused for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before moving on to the next agenda item. In the gallery above, someone started a sound that was picked up by others, and by the time it spread across the tiers, it was something that could not quite be called applause because different species have different ways of expressing that feeling, but it was the same feeling expressed in 40 different ways at once, and it filled the dome space under the stars and went nowhere because sound doesn't travel in the vacuum outside, but inside the room it was enormous. The Helva delegate put her face in her hands. She stayed that way. For a while. No one looked away from her because it was not the kind of moment you look away from. Marcus Idris made a note in his session record, and then he looked up at the moderator and said the Earth Confederacy was ready to proceed to the trade routing discussion whenever the session was ready. He said it calmly. He said it like a person who has done the thing that needed doing and is now ready to do the next thing. Princess Ureldara watched him for the rest of the morning. She watched the way he engaged with every item on the agenda with the same level of attention, the way he listened to the smaller delegations with the same focus he gave to the major ones, the way he never made anyone feel that their concern was smaller than someone else's concern. She thought about the file she had read 2 nights ago, the section on human grief and human recovery, the note that said the mechanism for their resilience was not clearly understood. She thought she understood it a little better now. It was not that they didn't feel things the file had been right about, that they felt everything enormously. It was not that loss made them hard or distant or closed. It was that they had decided, somewhere in their long and difficult history, that feeling things was not the same as being stopped by them, that grief was real and loss was real and anger was real, and none of that meant you stopped. It meant you carried it with you and you kept going and you used what you had learned from the carrying to be better at the next thing. It was not a comfortable way to be alive. It was an extraordinary way to be alive. She found him on the observation deck that evening. It was a wide curved space on the upper level of the station with a full transparent wall that faced away from the station's main lighting and gave an unobstructed view of open space. The stars out here were very clear and very cold looking, and the station's slow rotation meant that the view shifted slightly over time so that if you stood there long enough, different parts of the sky came into view. He was standing near the center of the window with his hands in his pockets again, and he was looking out. She came and stood beside him. For a while neither of them said anything, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have already said the important things. Then she asked him the question she had been turning over since the corridor. How do your people carry it? She said, the loss and the anger and the knowing and still choosing this. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. There is a word in one of the old Earth languages, he said, a language that most humans don't speak anymore, but it left a lot of words behind in the ones they do speak. The word is ***. It means a kind of longing for something you have lost, or maybe something you never had. A feeling that is sad and also beautiful at the same time, because the sadness means the thing mattered. He looked out at the stars. Humans are very good at Saudade. He said, we've had a lot of practice, we've lost a lot of things, we've lost people and places and whole versions of what we thought the future was going to look like. He paused. I think somewhere along the way we figured out that hate is just grief that forgot what it was for. He said, grief remembers the thing it lost, and it hurts because the thing was worth having. Hate forgets that and just burns without direction. It is easier in some ways. Hate doesn't require you to remember the thing clearly, it just requires you to be angry. He turned and looked at her. We chose to remember instead, he said. We chose to feel the loss clearly and carry it clearly and let it remind us what we were doing all of this for. He looked back at the stars. That is the only honest answer I have, he said. She stood beside him and looked out at the same stars. They were the same stars her empire spanned, billions of them, systems and worlds and populations and histories spread across an enormous dark, the stars that her ancestors had charted and named and claimed and built around. They felt smaller than they had before. Not because they were less, they were exactly what they had always been, vast and cold and indifferent. They felt smaller because she was standing next to something that was, in its own quiet way, larger. She did not say this out loud. She did not need to. They stood together on the observation deck while the station turned slowly and the view shifted and new stars came into frame and old ones moved on, and somewhere far below the rest of the summit was still happening. Delegates eating and talking and planning and calculating. And the work went on the way work always goes on, even when extraordinary things are happening right beside it. And the human diplomat and the Sorvati princess stood in the light of other suns and did not speak, and the silence between them was the silence of two people from very different worlds who had found, in a maintenance corridor in the middle of the night, something that was more honest than politics and more durable than power. The kind of thing that does not get written into the formal session records. The kind of thing that does not appear in the intelligence files or the diplomatic cables or the history summaries that generations later will describe this summit in careful and abbreviated terms. The kind of thing that travels differently. Quietly. Surely. Person to person to person. The way the most important things always have.